This is my 1987 BMW K75, and this is a classic example of how a simple job can get away from you. Now, what I was originally going to do was replace some of the screws that held on the mudguards. And these screws here, these have been fused in here for years. I've not been able to undo them. I've bought some new ones and I've got a heat gun and I need to get them out now. To take the wheel off, you have to jack the front of the bike up to take the weight off the front wheel. In order to do that, I had to take the belly pan off. The belly pan isn't original to my bike. I decided that I want one. I saw one come up and I fitted this back in 2020. Taking the belly pan off reveals that the exhaust is leaking. You can see that oily patch. So that's the first thing to have a look at. You can see that the front cylinder is actually leaking oil. So it wasn't that long ago that I actually resealed this, so this just needs pinching up tight and hopefully that will cure that. To take the front wheel off, you have to jack the bike up to lift the tyre off the ground, but before you do that you need to undo the pinch bolts and the main axle. You also need to take the calipers off, and now you can see how this job escalates. The bike toolkit has everything you need to do this job. It's very comprehensive and you can do nearly all of the maintenance on this bike just using this toolkit. Every now and then you need a small socket. While the tyre is still on the ground and it can't turn, loosen everything off that you're going to remove. So basically the caliper bolts, the 2 pinch bolts and the retaining cap off the end of the axle. The caliper bolts will be very stiff, so you can use the sleeve from the wheel wrench and then push that down really hard. If they've been correctly maintained, they'll just loosely undo. The top one in. So I'm doing this all cack-handed because I'm not actually left-handed. You can just whee. That's undone. Move down to the retaining cap for the axle. Do the same thing, just loosen that off and then move on to the pinch bolts. When it's all finger tight, take out the axle retaining bolt, which you can see lots of nice copperies on there, and then we need to make sure that this will turn. Remember, these are all loose now. This will turn before we actually take the weight off the bike, and probably just use a screwdriver for that. Put the screwdriver through the hole and you can see that's nice and loose. So jack the bike up so the tyre's just off the ground. If you jack it too far, it may pull it off the main stand and it will try and roll over on you, so be really careful about that. When you're taking the calipers off, just wiggle them a bit side to side so that it's opening the pads, so when it comes to put it back on, it's very much easier to put it back on, and then they can just hang over under their own weight. This is all hand tight now, so this can come out, and what I do is I'll get a couple of pots and keep the fasteners for each side separate, and also don't put them on the ground so that they can get sand or grit in the threads, which is pretty fatal. All I need to do is drop the other one off now and the main spindle is ready to come out. The spindle or axle is ready to come out. Remember that this is a spacer and this will drop out, and this is a spacer and this will drop out. They're 2 different sizes, one's small and one's large, and you should be able to, if it's well maintained, do it with one hand. Once the axle is out and the spacers have dropped out, you can just roll the front wheel out and put it somewhere safe. Now, normally you'd be taking the front wheel off to get a new tyre. There's not really any other reason to take it off unless it's damaged. Make sure it goes back on the same way as it came off. As the forks and the yoke are really quite corroded at the moment, having not been cleaned for a few years. I'm going to take the yoke off, which means I can actually then turn the forks outwards, which gives me more opportunity of getting at these and striking these out. The yoke's undone and that came off really easily, and it also means I can turn the forks. In order to take the yoke off, I need to lift the rubber seals, and I really want to clean properly inside there, so I am going to take it off. If you take the rubber seals in, you can look down and look at the actual stanchion seal, and it's in really good condition. There's no oil leakage. This grease is bicycle grease that I put in there to stop the metal corroding, and well, I must have done that 5 or 6 years ago now, and it's still all sound, which is good. This gives me the opportunity to give these a really good clean. I'm going to use a wire brush to get all the rubbish off first and then polish it up with Soval Autosol, and also gives me a chance to have a good go at these and try and drive these things out. I've put the yoke back on and tightened it down, so roll the wheel back in carefully so that you don't prang the discs on the frame, and get it to where it's nearly lined up. So the trick is, now you need to put the axle in as far as there, then you need to put in the spacer that needs to go in there, and I usually just plaster it with lip grease so that it stays in there of its own accord, and then line those two up. And you'll need 2 hands for that, because you'll need to lift the wheel and hold the axle. When you've tapped it through that far, you need to go to the other side and put the large spacer into that gap. Again, grease it up before it goes in. When you've lined it up on this side, use your screwdriver and wind it in. It should be able to easily rotate. It's going to be stiff because it's going to be slightly out of line. When it's got to that far, you can then tap it through. I've just gently tapped it through to there. That doesn't go any further. In here, this is tight against this spacer now, and on the other side you can see the end of the axle waiting for the retaining bolt and collar, and you can just put that in. If the bolt heads are looking a bit corroded, just put them in a drill, run them around with a very fine wet and dry paper and get the worst of it off. They will corrode again, but at least they'll corrode equally and look the right colour. The front wheel is back on, and the trick to aligning it is to leave all of the fastenings only hand tight, having tightened them by hand with the Allen key. Tighten the brake calipers up as tight as you can do them. If you're a professional mechanic, you'd know what the torque is, but basically it's Allen key and your strength. And then the trick is to roll the bike off its stand and bounce it up and down 3 or 4 times before then doing everything uptight. And you just bounce it down. You do that 2 or 3 times, and this puts everything in the correct alignment. Once that's done, do up everything tight. Just go around and do up everything that needs doing. The axle bolt, the pinch bolts. Make sure the brakes are done up nice and tightly, and what I always do is I use this sleeve to just give me a bit of extra purchase, just so that I can get that nice and tight. Then I know it's not going to undo itself. And that's that front wheel alignment done. So now I'm going to have to go off and buy myself a decent drill bit to try and sort out these rusty little devils. I knew it was hot today, but that does seem unrealistic.